Well, good morning and welcome on a Friday at 10:45. Are you in the right session? Because if you're not, you're going to stay now because I'm going to make them lock the doors so you can't leave. Okay, so if you don't know me, if this thing works, I work at Productivity. I do lots of things SharePoint, and I have done for a very, very long time. I worked with SharePoint before it was called SharePoint, so I worked way back before the 2001 version of SharePoint, so I've had many, many years of the same issues again and again and again and again and again. You can follow me on Twitter at HelloIt'sLiam, and my blog site, if the pointer actually works, is helloitsliam.com, and I'm also one of the SharePoint MVPs. So what are we going to talk about today? There we go. Okay, the key is to just shove your finger through the device. So we're going to talk about access control. We'll talk about controlling getting to SharePoint, because that's the first piece. Because when we talk about security, the first thing is, how do you get in? Then, secondly, we'll talk about securing the content, because at the end of the day, the reason why you're going to SharePoint is to get to stuff. Whether it's your personal MP3 collection. I have seen that many, many times. Well, we've got this SharePoint application in my site, it's full of MP3s. And the legal issues of that are... But hey, people use it for whatever else. And then we'll talk about infrastructure security, because that's really where it finishes. It's, well, how do the users get in? How do we kind of control what they're supposed to do? And then how do we protect everything afterwards? So, the first question I got is, what's the problem? Why do we have to have a session on security for SharePoint? Because you'd think by now that you guys have figured this out. I mean, come on, realistically, SharePoint's been around since 2001. Well, before that, we've had 2003 and 2007 and 2010 and 2013. 2016's around the corner, and you've got Office 365. Have we not figured this out already? Should we do a show of hands who actually thinks they've got it sorted? Nope, I didn't think so. So what's the issue? Well, I'll tell you what. Let's go back to my cat picture for a minute. Now, I'm going to have to do this like over here because, for whatever reason, my machine doesn't like doing stuff. Okay, so let me go to this one. Oh, look at that. Yeah, I'm not a great fan. No, I like cats, but what I'm not a fan of is people who post pictures of cats. You know who they are. It may be you, so I apologize. I already have an instant hatred for you. But no, you know who they are. I had a friend of mine, he would post pictures, the stupid quote ones, and like, oh, look at cat. I'm like, seriously, what is wrong with you? Like, kill those, block you. Why have you blocked me? Stop posting cat pictures. So, what we did is I took the picture, and I want to kind of illustrate what the problem could be. So I uploaded the picture. It's called Smiley Cat. I'm sure you have tons of these in SharePoint. I'm sure if you did a search for cat pictures in your own SharePoint, there'd probably be a bunch. You'd be like, who keeps putting cat pictures in there? And then they'll all be tagged as administrator, so you never know. So what we're going to do is we're going to view, I'm going to open it in a new tab. Ooh. So what just happened? That was an image. But the image didn't load as an image. What did it load as? A weird-looking page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and then what I'm going to do is just do ipconfig. Did you know you could do that? Oh, and there was silence. Trust me, this isn't that easy to do, but I'm just letting you know that this is the problem. So I just uploaded something into SharePoint. SharePoint didn't do anything with it. I opened the page up, and now I can do ipconfig. Now, this example that I'm running through is something that's been around for many, many years. One of the guys that's presenting here, a guy called Marcus Murray, did a presentation on something similar to this. So this is a problem, because this could be me as a third-party vendor. I have access to the site. I upload something very simplistic, and now all of a sudden I can get information about your server. So let me try something else. Let's just do, did I spell that right? Yep. Host name. It's my box. Gives me the host name now. Now what I really want to do is do something a little bit more, where's my mouse gone? There it is. Something a little bit more dangerous. I'm not going to tell you how this works, but I just want to show you what you can do. So I'm now going to paste a PowerShell command into that little box in a web page. So let's just deconstruct it for a second. I'm going to use standard PowerShell. I'm going to go ahead and download a file from the server. Obviously, I'm using a self-contained environment for various reasons. I'm going to download my evil text file, because we all have an evil text file. I'm going to tell it to save it in the temp directory of the server, and I'm going to call it good.exe, because I want to convert my evil to good. And then I'm going to tell PowerShell to run it. And you're all sitting there thinking, is that actually going to work? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. Now what I'm going to do before I do that is I'm going to quickly pop over here and show you that my Linux machine is waiting. Yes, I just showed a Linux machine, I apologize. But you'll see it's listening for something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over here, and I'm going to copy that. I'm then going to go back to my fantastic browser, and I'm going to get rid of that, paste that, and I'm going to run that. And then I'm going to leave it going, and I'm going to go over here. Okay. So my little Linux machine that could be sitting outside your corporate environment, could be sitting in the network, has now just received a message from your SharePoint server that you didn't know could talk to this machine because I ran some PowerShell within a browser application. So now I'm talking. Now what I can do is I can go over here and just to prove that I am actually on the one, I'm going to do sysinfo, and that's the server. So I'm on a remote machine now, connected through the browser to your server. So let's just make it a bit more interesting. So I'm going to run get system, and this will go ahead. And this is good because it says you need to have elevated privileges. But I could run a whole series of commands. I could run get services. I could run a whole bunch of stuff that would give me all of the system services that run on the machine. I can then use a command called migrate and elevate the account of the application pool, which is what I'm running under. So just be aware what account you're running under as. What level of permission does the application pool account have? Oh, come on, you should know this. It's Superman, isn't it? The application pool account needs access to everything, literally everything. He may not be an admin on the box, but for SharePoint purposes, he has access to everything. So I'm now running under the context of that account. So I can now go through and elevate that account. Now, that's not the purpose of the session. But I wanted to show you that this is the problem, because I can do that. So you don't want me to look at your SharePoint environments ever, because we can do more than that too. There's a lot more things we can do with commands like this. But that was just to illustrate the problem. So let's go and delve into the problem a little bit further. Nope. OK, we'll do this. Let's talk about data breaches for a second. Let's see how paranoid you really are. Let's see how good you are at knowing what data breaches have happened in the past few years. OK, let's do a timeline. Let's take a 10-year block. Hopefully you've all worked in IT. Most of you look like you've been in IT for a while. You've either got no hair or grey hair. That means you've been in there for a while, and that's even the guys that are in the 20s. Yeah, I'm 20, I've got grey hair. Yeah. What happened? Well, I've been working with SharePoint for a year. So back in 2005, we had America Online. Anybody remember that? AOL? Woohoo, yeah. There was a breach. And then it kind of went quiet for a bit. And in 2007, TJ Maxx. Bit of an issue there. First kind of point of sale kind of breach that took place. Actually, one of these issues, the TJ Maxx one, was to do with their wireless network. How interesting was that? Because back then, nobody cared about security, did they? It was like, yeah, what's the password for the Wi-Fi? Password? Just a side note, you might want to check your password for your Wi-Fi at home. Because I drive around, so no, I don't. I have been known to, but not probably where you live. So let's skip a couple of years forward. We go to 2009. Heartland Payment Systems was the biggest breach that was taken for payment systems. Let's skip a little bit further forward, if this decides to work. WikiLeaks. Anybody seen the couple of movies that are out about the whole WikiLeaks thing? This is the early days when it all began, when we started publishing stuff that we shouldn't have and started seeing stuff on WikiLeaks. Then we jump a few years ahead, and we have what's called Court Ventures. This was a big one. This was probably one of the largest breaches that took place. 200,000 billion information sold. Confidential information was stolen, and it was managed to get hold of by a Vietnam theft group that managed to steal it. So let's talk about some of the big ones. And now you should know about this one. 77 million accounts. Any of you lot? I was one. I don't even have a PlayStation. How does that work? But I have an account. Apparently I signed up for PlayStation Network at some point in my life, even though I don't own a PlayStation, but my account was one that got compromised. Let's move on. 2013. Evernote. Anybody use that? It's better now. It wasn't then. Personal information was taken. Anybody use Living Social? Personal information hacked and taken again. 2014. Let's do some big ones. Adobe. That was a big one. That was just them being silly. Need better security for that one. Anybody got done by this one? I did too. The one day that I didn't use the card that I have specifically for Target was the day that my credit card details got stolen. One day. What are the odds of that happening? eBay. 145 million employee stuff, credentials taken, personal details, just endless amounts of them. Chase, Home Depot, Anthem. These are all big names, aren't they? These are not like the small mom and pop shops around the corner. Oh, it's the flower shop got hacked again. I mean, what am I going to do? How can I order my flowers for Mother's Day? You know, it's not that. These are big names. Do you think these guys have good security? Be careful how you answer that. You would like to say yes. But quite clearly, there were some issues here. So, who thinks, let's do a show of hands, who thinks SharePoint is secure out of the box? No one? Oh, no. 1, 2. Wow. So you actually think SharePoint's insecure out of the box? No one's going to answer, are they? They're like, is it a trick question? I can tell you, my personal opinion, SharePoint out of the box in a vanilla install is secure as you're going to get it. Why? Because you build a server, you put the disk in, you install it, you've got SQL, it sits inside your network, it's protected by Active Directory. Done. So who keeps breaking it? It's not me. It's all of you lot. But it is. What do? We try to do weird things with SharePoint. We try to publish it outside. We don't do it properly. We forget to protect this and forget to do that. And then, of course, as we found out in the session yesterday, that nobody trusts the end users. So we blame them. Well, quite clearly, it must be the users. Well, maybe there's an element of truth to that. So let's talk about how we control access to them. How weird it works over here. So let's talk about the difference. Who thinks there's a difference between authentication and authorization? Okay, so we have a good show. That means people have been listening and slowly learning. When we used to ask this question back a few years ago, people would be like, I don't know. Are they the same? No, they are different. Authentication is the verification of the claim to prove who you are. So when you go to the bank, you go to an ATM, you shove your card in the machine, it doesn't just give you money. That would be pretty cool. Just put the card in, money comes out. That would be fantastic, but it doesn't do that. You have to provide something to verify who you are. See, it's not working again now. Authorization is the verification to prove that you actually have access. So, you type in the SharePoint URL on your workstation. The first request is always anonymous, whether you believe that or not. But it always is. You open your laptop, you log into the network, you go HTTP SharePoint, and anonymous request hits the SharePoint server, and SharePoint says, I have no idea who you are. And there's like a weird moment where he's looking at you going, I think I know you. I'm not really sure. And so it turns back to the browser and then says, go and tell him he's got to log in. And so your browser says, I have credentials, and sends them back. And then you get logged in. That's great. And then you get an access is denied. How does that work? Because the authorization stopped you. Just because you have valid credentials does not mean you are allowed to do something. So understand the difference. I used to speak to a lot of developers, and they would often misunderstand some of that. Authentication precedes the authorization process. And we need to understand that with SharePoint, because when we build, for example, take an extranet scenario, you really want to understand the differences between the two. You have a valid account to come in, but that does not give you blanket access to all of the content. But we break that because we misunderstand the difference between the two. There are two exceptions. The exception would be anonymous blog comments, because quite clearly you're not authenticated, but you are authorized generally for everyone. Anonymous users are already authorized, but you're not authenticated. You know what? I was doing some stuff a while back, and I was looking at different SharePoint sites that are available on the internet, because there's loads of SharePoint sites on the internet now. You can do all kinds of searches and find loads of them. And I found a SharePoint site that when you hit it anonymously, that if you went to the the settings page, it says you were logged in as the application pool account. How does that even work? Like, how much have you messed up SharePoint if when an anonymous user hits the site, I'm logged in as the application pool account? Let's just say there was a whole bunch of stuff that we could do with the SharePoint site for that, because we could then just delete stuff, add stuff, do whatever we needed to. So let's understand the authorization process a little bit more. SharePoint does the authorization. It does it after authentication, unless it's anonymous. And what it does is it checks, is the user a member of a group? Does the member have access? Is the user account added to the ACL of the object? Does the user have the required attributes? Because we could be doing user permissions, group permissions, we could be doing claim attribute permission, we could be doing that. If we're using something like ADFS or you're in the cloud with federated authentication, then you would have an attribute that would come back. You know, maybe you want to authenticate all the men who wear red high heels on Thursday into SharePoint. I know there's at least one of you. No. No, hopefully not. I don't want to know if you did. SharePoint only understands what you tell it. Who thinks SharePoint's like artificial intelligence? That it just knows what you want to do? Well, I went to the SharePoint site and it says I couldn't get in. Okay, it should let me in. Well, you tell you what, you go back to your desk and talk to the screen and eventually it'll let you in. It's not how that works. Just because you're logged in doesn't give you permission to get to stuff. The end users don't understand that. Well, I can't get to it. But do you need access to it? Well, of course I do. Ask the question. I always ask this. When the CTO or the CEO comes to you and says, I want access to all this stuff in SharePoint, do you say no? Some of you are like, yeah, I'm not going to answer that because he might be listening. But no, sometimes we don't, do we? We just be like, yep, whatever, okay, cool. Why? Why do they need access to that? Why do you not need access to it? Why does your normal account need access to all the... Well, I'm an admin. I don't care. Admins don't need access to anything. You need to fix the servers. You need to make stuff work. You don't need access to all the content in the HR site. As much as it's good fun to go through and look at payroll and everything else, the best approach for authorization when you're building something in SharePoint is to use security groups and roles. Now, I've had this conversation, stroke argument quite a few times, because you can add users, can't you? You can assign permissions to individual users. So what's this magic threshold? So I've got 3 users, and I want to give them specific permissions. Do I need to create an AD group for that? Can I have a site group for that? You know what? I don't really care how you do it. But just use some common sense. If you have 50,000 users that need permissions, don't assign 50,000 sets of unique permissions. Use AD groups or use site groups and have a higher container. The key for SharePoint is to make sure that you kind of limit the level of permission. I've seen SharePoint environments where there's so many unique individual permissions that search just really, really struggles. Because when it tries to crawl, so search goes ahead, it crawls, it finds a Word document, cracks open the ACL of the Word document, and then says what permissions are on that file. If you've got 50,000 unique permissions on that file, it just sits there going for hours, and eventually it'll just go, I got nothing. That's before it opens the content and does anything. I saw a SharePoint environment completely crash because there were 350,000 unique permissions on a specific place. Now, don't ask me how they got in there. Have you ever tried adding users? That's in 350,000 unique permissions. That blew me away. I said, did you code something? They were like, I don't know, just... Somebody was quite clearly bored that day. 1, 2... It's the same as downloading files from SharePoint, isn't it? I want to download 1,000 files from SharePoint. It's going to be a long day. It's like that thing that took place a few years ago, the whole Bradley Manning thing, where he took stuff out of SharePoint. You may not know it was in SharePoint, but it was in SharePoint. He took 250,000 cables out of SharePoint. When I first heard that, I was mightily impressed. Well, one, that somebody put 250,000 documents in SharePoint first, but then he got them all out. 1, 2, 3. And you think he did like Explorer view. Yeah, it's not going to happen. No. Bradley Manning actually used the wget script to do it. Okay. He actually used a one-liner. So if you've used wget before, wget is just an old-school command. You just run it and say, here's my library, and it downloads the whole lot. It takes about 2 seconds. And then what you do is, to make sure, you put SSL certificate on it, and then wget fails. And then what's great about wget is there's a little flag that says, ignore the SSL certificate. And then it ignores it and then downloads all the files. Now, I have done that demo before. I'm not going to do that today. I'm trying to avoid showing you all that, but there were ways of doing that. But yes. So let's talk about on-premises then. So who has an on-premises SharePoint implementation? Impressive. Who has just a 365 implementation? There's only a couple of you. That's what I expected. Who has both? Who doesn't even know what SharePoint is? I've got Sitecore. Yeah, I'm using OpenText. No. So we have a whole lot. So what does on-premises support? This is probably the majority. Who's using this for their authentication? Just basic Windows NTLM. Just out of the box, I open it up, it just logs in. This is the standard approach. And that's why when I say out of the box is secure, this is what I mean. Because it's actually quite hard to break credentials from an Active Directory. I'm not saying it can't be done, and it's very straightforward, the approach, but it's actually complicated to break a password. Because you don't know the password, you have to take the hash of the password and then do a whole bunch of weird stuff to make it work. In actual fact, the attack that you would use would be a pass the hash. So you would use something like the attack that I did earlier, where it would go ahead and grab it, and then you would pass the hash you've got from the user account and pass it back in again along the chain until you can authenticate. The other option we got is forms-based. Who's using forms-based authentication to SharePoint in some instance? Normally, you find that this is for external access. It could be extranets. You may have a public-facing site that requires that. We can do LDAP directory, so you could have lightweight directory services running, because, of course, you don't want to give your external users full AD creds, so you could use LDAP services. You could have a table with SQL passwords in, or you could have a spreadsheet, whatever you wanted to. Anything that's a membership and role provider. SAML-based, anybody using things like ADFS, any of the third-party ones, so that's actually a little bit less. I'm quite surprised, actually. I thought there'd be more that would be using some kind of federated platform. And this is great. There's tons of platforms for this. It doesn't have to be ADFS. It can be a mix of anything. But what's great about this is that this can be used on-premises and in cloud. And you can do a mix of a cloud service as well as an on-premises infrastructure. So you can do both for this. And then, of course, this will be the OAuth mechanism that's all singing and dancing. And this is mostly for dev stuff. Except if you're using Link, or you're using Exchange, or you're using Office Web Apps, there'll be an OAuth mechanism. So you're doing high-end server-to-server connectivity. Who's actually using the app model on-premises? That's about the amount of hands I would have expected to see, which is a shame. Who's using app model in the cloud? Okay? Who doesn't even know what the app model is? There's a few. Who really doesn't care? That should be the rest of you. There's like 8 people put their hands up and everyone's going, I don't know what he's talking about. But yes, app model development. This is the future. I hate to say it. I haven't really embraced it. I haven't done for a long time, and now I am, and I think it's great. And this is the future, because we're being pushed down that route. So we have to understand how that works and the implications of security. Because if I go ahead and build a custom app, and I store it in a provider-hosted app, and I connect it to SharePoint, I need to understand how that works. How do my end users get access to that? Well, somebody has to install it. You know what it's like when you download an app on your phone? Anybody ever read what it's asking to get access to? And some of you are like, yeah. And the rest of you are like, no. Because you don't, you're just like, I want access to your firstborn child. Yes. And it's done. And then we use the app. And we just use the app because we want the app. And that's how SharePoint works. There's an authorization process, but it should be more controlled because you own that infrastructure. So what about SharePoint Online? SharePoint Online is all about SAML-based authentication. Notice there's no Windows NTLM here. You don't get to do that. So we have SAML-based on-premises. We can do a redirect back to an on-premises ADFS implementation or something else, or we can use the cloud-based mechanisms. We can use a third-party vendor, whatever we need to. I'm definitely using OAuth. And then, of course, what we can do is use Active Directory, but this is a little bit different to your regular Active Directory. We're going to be using Azure Active Directory, and then we're going to use DirSync or AD Connect to sync those accounts. Because remember that in SharePoint Online, you have basically two different types of accounts. You have a federated account or a cloud account. That's it. There isn't really any difference right now. Okay, you have external users, but they don't really count as such because they're just cloud identities. That's the difference. There's just two. So when we're looking at doing a hybrid environment, or we're looking at building a cloud only, or you want to build an extranet, so think of the scenario, because this is a common scenario that we see all the time. You have an on-premises implementation, and you want to have an extranet. Where do you build the extranet? Well, that comes down to one question. Do you want to be the owner of the credentials? I don't. You know, based on the hacks that have took place over the past 10 years, I really don't want to own people's credentials. I would like to throw those credentials away, have them stored somewhere else, and not worry about it. So that means that that choice that we've got is based around where they need to go. For us, we've done a lot of work where the extranet's in 365. Because 365 is nice and secure, I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to sync credentials. I create cloud identities, provide licenses, and give them access. And then my internal employees can be synchronized from on-premises up to the cloud. And it works great. So think of that scenario. As you come to build something like that, start to utilize the cloud services the way it should be. So let me just skip through this one. We'll come back to that. So let's talk about content security, because that's really where it's going to be. Who thinks their content's nice and secure? There's got to be at least one of you. There you go. Oh, there's a couple now. So what makes your content secure? Is it that you have no users? I mean, because that would be the ultimate, wouldn't it? My content is so secure, we have no users. It's so secure, in fact, that it's on a USB stick in my pocket. And you know people do this. Okay, so that's another question. Who stores copies of all their stuff on their C drive? See, nobody's going to put their hand up. No one ever confesses to this. Okay, D drive then. Let's go with a D drive or a secondary drive. Yeah, not the system drive, because if I have to rebuild it, that's a pain. So I'll put it on the other drive. Yeah. Who puts it? Who uses like OneDrive for Business or OneDrive Pro or some cloud provider and then synchronizes it to 70 devices? But I do. I fall into that category because, well, if that one dies, then I've got them over here and I've got them over here. And then who has copies of it just in case? Everybody does. That's what we do. So is your content really secure if there's 50 copies of it everywhere? No. Well, it is, and it's not. You can only control the master, can't you? If your master storage is SharePoint, you can control that. If your master storage is OneDrive for Business, you can control that. Some of the features that we talked about yesterday afternoon for OneDrive for Business will help you fix some of that. You can store it in SharePoint Online, and some of those features will fix that too. So how do we kind of secure our content? Well, first off, if we're looking at in the cloud or on premises, we've got to talk about kind of looking after the data as it's at rest or it's in transit. So let's kind of fictitiously walk through what would be a man-in-the-middle attack. So a man-in-the-middle attack, I decide to drive by your office one day, and I see that your Wi-Fi network is open, or at least easy to break the password, and I hook into your Wi-Fi network. I do a bit of a port scan, because this is the process I would go through. You port scan, you do an Nmap scan across the entire network, you find the devices, and then you start to run some other tests and say, oh, I found the SharePoint server, I found the SQL server, I found the AD. So you find all this information. Now all I need to do is I need to be physically on the network and do something. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do, let's say I'm going to use an ARP attack. I'm going to poison your network. Sounds really cool, doesn't it, that? I'm going to poison the network. I'm going to poison it. I'm going to do a DNS poisoning. So I'm going to know that I found your box. I'm going to monitor the traffic for a bit, and I'm going to see that all of your employees are going to http sharepoint.com. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to poison your network. I'm going to then just put a little record in there that says, what I want you to do is whenever anybody types sharepoint.com, I want it to come to my machine and then go back out again. And everyone's looking, thinking, can you do that? Yes, you can. It's actually very straightforward. So when I type HTTP SharePoint, it goes from your machine, it hits my machine goes, hello, decrypt, see what's going on, and send it off. And you have no idea. But you've got an SSL certificate, haven't you? And that makes no difference. Because I'll just front it with a different SSL certificate on the way through so I can decrypt the packets. And then what I'm going to do is keep watching, and I figure out the URLs, and I figure out where you go, and now I'm going to start playing. I'm going to try and connect, I'm going to try and upload, I'm going to try and get credentials, I'm going to try and do something. So how do we fix that? Well, there isn't really a fix as such. You can do the SSL encryption from end to end. You can do encryption at the physical files. Who's using TDE inside SQL? One guy, two guys, 3, 4, 5. That's not bad, 6. Who doesn't even know what TDE is? TDE is done at the SQL level, where you can encrypt the database. You can go by a per content database specific and encrypt the entire database. Once it's done, then it means that anything that, if I manage to compromise the SQL server and take the database, there's nothing I can do unless I have your private key. That's an important thing, and we'll talk about TDE in a little bit. But what about protecting the content? If I manage to somehow compromise someone's account details, how do you stop me opening those files? Well, we use information rights management. We use IRM. We put IRM in place, whether it's on-premises or in the cloud, or whether you've hooked up Azure RMS, because Azure has a service that you can now use on-premises. So we use RMS, we use the information rights management piece to encrypt the files. That's going to put something in the header of the document that then says when I try to open it, it's going to call home, and then it's going to fail and say, hey, you can't do anything. We should be using that. There isn't really any excuses for not using that. Maybe cost, but an internal implementation of IRM is very, very useful because you can have it protect emails as well as SharePoint content. So we need to protect the content itself. We can do path-based, location-controlled access. So we can go in and say, so what I often find is when people publish their SharePoint site, through the firewall, as an extranet, it's normally just a single rule that says publish this. And so anybody who then decides to get access to SharePoint can then see all of the path unless you've specifically blocked out access. But we don't need to do that. If you're publishing stuff outside, you can actually use the firewall to block paths. You can say, you know what, block that path. Block this. One of the tests that we always used to do was go to the all-site content page in SharePoint from outside and see if you can get to it. Because when we build something, sometimes we have anonymous access because we want to have like a nice welcome page. And then when they drill down, we want them to then do access at that point. But then something like that is then exposed and we can see other content. Most of the time we do this. We do permission-based. We just use groups and roles and whatever else it would be to assign the permission to what we need to. And then, of course, attribute-based, using any of the mechanisms that we can provide. Something else over and above. Because if you think how the process works for a federated authentication. So what you're doing is you're telling SharePoint that we don't really care where they come from. They get bounced over to an authentication mechanism, whatever the third party would be, or whether it's ADFS or 365 or Azure AD, whatever it is. And then when they get authenticated over there, we wrap everything up into an authent token that's wrapped into XML with a certificate, which is the SAML attribute markup, which is a piece of XML about this big. And then SharePoint gets it and then says, I don't know who you are. Because it needs to have a trust, an SSL certificate trust between the two endpoints. So when I have the certificate from this side to this side, it can then decrypt the SSL packet, the actual SAML token, and then say, oh, hey, it's Liam. I know who you are. Come in. So we can do attribute-based. We can inject other stuff in there. I did some stuff recently where we used ADFS. ADFS went to the cloud. It came back. And then we also had it connect out to other applications to get information. So think of how you would have done this before. If you wanted to have somebody log in to a site and then go and get some HR information, you would kind of have them log in and then do another call later on to go and get the HR information. Wouldn't it be better if at the point of auth and coming in, we can go and get there so we don't have to go back? So we can do that with attribute-based authentication at that point. So access control. When we're looking at content permissions, we're going to be using these three specific things: security groups, user accounts, and everything else. But access permissions can be done a little bit differently. So you still have the three standards: security groups, user accounts, and claim attributes, but now we have multi-factor. You can't apply out of the box multi-factor to content permissions. You have to get something else to do there. To say, I've got a Word document, you have access, but I also require something else from you. Wouldn't it be nice, this is always one thing I wish we could have, is that I could do what's called compound claims. So I could be able to say, in order for you to access document number 1, you have to be a member of this group and this group. Because you can't do that yet. Because it just fails, because you can't have that and that in regular SharePoint. It's once you have one, it lets you straight in. But it would be nice to do the compound idea. Or we can do device. ADFS or any of the other providers allow you to do device-specific. And we talked a little bit about this in the OneDrive session yesterday, where you can control access by a device. Because if you have secure content, you don't really want anybody connecting from any device. But what's the issue? That you build a platform like this, you want everyone to have it, they bring their own devices, and then they require access to that. Normally, it's one of the people in the exec team that will come through and say, I can't get to it from my iPhone. You know, you're like, well, that's great, you're not supposed to. Nope, I need it on my phone. And then you give it to them and they never look at it. But you've now just created another endpoint of access. But we can do device-specific controls. But it becomes a nightmare. So how many of you have implemented multi-factor auth for all of your end users? There's a few. That's what I expected. Because guaranteed your users are not ready for that yet. The idea of being prompted for something else, does it annoy you? Yeah, you like go to a website and you go in, even though stupid captcha things are annoying, you go in and fill a form out and you think, you can't read them. You go and it's like, oh, what is that? And you click it and you go, nope, try again. Oh, can't believe I got it wrong. But we're not ready for this. But we need to train our users to the idea of multi-factor, because why? This is the way of protection. It's all about something that you know, something that's personal to me that allows me to get in. Is it a PIN? Is it not? So I bank with one of the banks here in the US, and when I go to log in, I think it's great now. I have to put in my username. I put in what used to be called a password, but it's now a memorable something. I don't know, they've changed the name. And then I have to get my cell phone out, and then I have to generate a code on my cell phone to then get in. Now, I'm okay with that, because it's a bank. And I would expect that. But if I'm getting to the Word document for the project that I'm working on, that's a bit of a pain for me. I don't want to have to, hold on a minute, I've got to get my phone out, generate a code, access in. But you know what? We've left with no choice now. If you look, remember the list of all the people that got hacked? Do you want to be added to that? I mean, I'm sure we could. We'll do a check of all the organizations that you work for in a bit, and then we'll pick you off one by one. So what about on-premises sharing? Because it's in the name, isn't it, really? SharePoint. It's all about sharing. It's all about collaboration. So, external links. We send those external links. I mean, who likes the on-premises sharing? Nothing. It could be better, couldn't it? I want to share you a link. What's the first issue? Well, I'm in the site. I click share in. I want to share it with Steve, who's at the other side of the world who doesn't work for me. So what do? It generates an email, and I send it to Steve. And Steve goes, click. Can't even get to it, because it's an internal URL. I mean, it's not going to work, is it? So we go through the process and we build it, but then I can't get him into the site. How do I get him in? Oh, you have to have, now we're back to the credential issue again. So the sharing doesn't quite work. But for internal sharing, it's okay. But it's a bit of a pain too, isn't it? Because how does the sharing work? So when I go in and say, I want to share this file with Steve and Sue and John, I somehow am assigning permissions to them to get to that file. So you're taking the permission control away from you as the IT admins and now allowing the end users to decide. Is that a good thing? No one wants to say. It's supposed to be a good thing. Let's just leave it at that. It's supposed to be a good thing. So what do we end up doing? We end up building a custom authentication mechanism of some description. And you become the source of the truth. I want to share a file. I share a file. I use a different URL. It goes outside. And then we have to give them credentials so they can access in. And then you become the source of the truth, which, as we learn, I would never want to do. I don't want to own those credentials. You know what? There's loads of other companies that are great at this. One of them would be Microsoft. They're pretty good at this approach. So yeah, let's utilize those. We don't want to be the source of the truth for authentication. But then we can move to a federated one, which does fix some of this. And of course, the announcements that Bill Baer made for 2016 and some of the Office 365 features come in allows us to do that. So we can go to a federated authentication system, but of course, then we get issues with people picker. Do you think it's great when you implement ADFS and the people picker just does nothing? I would like to find John. So you type John and John goes, I'm here. So you add John, and then John can't get in because that wasn't the claim you were supposed to be adding, because it's not John. It's john.something at full email address. So what do we have to build? A custom claim provider to make that work. But then we can do partner federation, because once we've built a federated platform, then we can federate with other organizations. When I worked back in the UK, I did some work with the Metropolitan Police Force, and we did some federation work between other police forces. They had ADFS, we had ADFS, and we would federate together because we didn't trust each other, but we could trust the federation because it was SSL decryption on each side. But then, of course, we can go with 365 federation. We can go straight to the cloud, and we can do on-premises sharing. And those are some of the features that are coming. And you saw this from Bill Baer. Some of the features that have been announced are to do with hybrid to 365. How great will that be? I can go to a file in my SharePoint site. I want to share that with Liam, who's in a different organization. And when he gets the link, it's going to go through the 365 authentication process and back in again. Now, do you think it's going to work like that? Let's do a vote. Who thinks it's going to be just as simple as that? You never know, it might be. It might be that simple. But you know as much as me, what's the issue with securing SharePoint? It's not straightforward. Unless you're ring-fencing it inside your network and it's just internal employees, it's a piece of cake. If it's outside of that, you have a whole host of options, a whole host of other things to worry about, and it's not as straightforward. It would be nice to click a button and it just work, but it doesn't quite work that way. So what about online sharing? Online sharing is the same thing. We use external links and everything else. We learned yesterday in one of the last sessions that there's lots of features coming for external sharing where we can expire the links out. So when we send one out, it can expire after a certain point. We can have it externally shared, and then it comes back to the 365, and then you can authenticate back through. So we know that online sharing is always going to be ahead of the on-premises environment, purely based on how everything is built. But then, of course, federated authentication can be done using Azure AD, which you all have behind your 365 tenant, Active Directory federated services, because you want to own that. Because remember that external sharing doesn't necessarily mean I'm not a member of your organization. Because most of us, I'm assuming most of us work in organizations where we have sister companies, we have parent companies, we're all a big group of organizations that come together. I've worked with a whole bunch of organizations that have ridiculous amounts of Active Directory because it's done by, we bought a company, we bought a company, we bought a company, and the integration piece never gets done. And then we end up with thousands of things all over the place. That becomes an issue. That is very complicated to solve. That's not a SharePoint problem. But it's manifested to the end user in the SharePoint implementation because I'm in Active Directory 27 and I can't get into the SharePoint site. So I call the administrator and say, I can't get in. And the guy's like, I have no idea. It's because the core infrastructure isn't connected. So if we go with online sharing, we can use just cloud identities. You can just go in and create one and say, Liam Cleary at hotmail.com or whatever it is. A cloud identity is my mechanism. And I would recommend that if you're doing an extranet or something simple and you're using online, utilize those. That's what they're there for. Do the external sharing, have external users added in. And with the features coming down the line where you can now assign, higher privilege licenses to them coming in the future, then you'll be able to have external users actually collaborate and do things. And controlled access for sharing is coming. If you didn't see the stuff yesterday, then you will have known that there'll be a way of you controlling, because not everybody should be sharing content, should they? Some people you trust and some people you don't. Some people are good and they'll be good at sharing. Others will just share everything with everybody. I'm sure if you look at your organization, there'll be at least one that always does it. They change permissions, they give access to everybody. They never pick a specific person, they always choose the everyone group, and then everybody gets access to everything. And that's how that works. Unfortunately, we have those users. And of course, then there's those other users that always try to get to stuff that they shouldn't get to. And I'm probably banking on that most of you are that user. Because I used to do it. The old school days of the NTFS shares. You see a folder that's shared, you're like, I wonder what's in there. So what do? You double click it, and it goes, access is denied. Ooh, there's something in there I want to see. There's probably nothing. But you know what? You wanted to see it just purely based on the fact that it's there. It's like, I want to see that one. But it's that approach. But we can now control access for sharing online. Those features will be coming soon. So let me just, we'll do some demos in a minute. So who thinks their infrastructure is nice and secure and built correctly? See, I put two things together then, didn't I? Nice and secure and built correctly are two different things. Okay, let's do, who thinks their infrastructure is built correctly? Okay, who thinks their infrastructure is secure? Yeah, it's like, who doesn't know at all? Who just kind of went with it and hoped it worked? Who actually read the documentation? Actually, there was more people read the documentation than said the environment was done properly. So that means you're reading it but doing nothing, or you're reading it and then just ignoring it. One of the two. But infrastructure security is the important. So think of the journey, okay? Is it protected from the outside? Have I understood the authentication process for the end user? Have I got that done? Can I control access to the content? Can I ensure that the content is protected like it should be? And then I go back, and what we do is we just stand up all these servers in the environment, and we turn off the Windows firewall because I can't get to it when the firewall's on. So I turn the Windows firewall off, and then we just stick them in there, and then I'm one of the IT admins, and it's a pain in the backside to have to VPN to remote desktop, so I just create a firewall rule that lets me remote desktop from outside the network. No one's going to confess to doing that, but trust me, there's lots of them. If you ever get bored one day, just search around the internet for a bit. There's a couple of places you can go to. If you get bored, look through the Comcast network, Comcast Business. There's loads of SharePoint environments stood up in the Comcast network. Or also the Amazon network, tons as well. And they all have remote desktop enabled. They're in the cloud, and I can remote desktop to them. Now, what we should do is apply a policy that says only from my IP addresses can I get to. But that would be too complicated, so they're available. Anybody tried to brute force a remote desktop session and get in? I was hoping somebody would raise their hand. It's actually a bit more complicated, but you can do it. You can brute force a remote desktop session. So let's talk about security. Let's talk about this, server isolation. This is one thing that I think we forget, that we just put the servers in and we inherently just trust the fact that it's in our data center. But actually, we should be using what's called server isolation. So let me diagram this one out. So I'm going to have 3 layers. So I've got 3 different colored circles and lots of firewalls. The firewalls just represent one firewall, but it was easier to draw 4 around it. And then we have the 3 layers, and the reason why I put the 3 layers is because we represent each of the layers of the servers. So we have database server, application server, and web server. Now, I don't care what servers they are, where you put them, whether you call them app servers, or if you're playing with 2016 and they're all different roles, it makes no difference, but they're isolated to those. Server isolation is all about the Windows Server firewall itself. There's a rule in the Windows Server firewall that says block everything that's not in this rule base. Now, if you turn the Windows firewall off, that doesn't work. Why would you want to stop anything else coming to the boxes other than what's allowed? Anybody remember I Love You virus? Yeah, wasn't it a great one? Wasn't it the most stupidest thing ever that we used to open, we used to open random attachments? I could send you like a VBS script or an exe called Smiley Cat, and you would just go, no way, Smiley Cat. And then you get a picture, you'd be like, that's cool. But in the background, it did a whole bunch of other stuff. And we didn't know who it came from. But you would open it anyway. And people still do that today. Server isolation would have resolved a lot of the issues with I Love You. So how did the I Love You virus work? Well, when you got it to your machine, so the organization I worked for back then, it was one of the salespeople. We'll leave it at that. It kind of made sense. And the salesperson opened the file, and then it went. And our Exchange server just literally died. It couldn't handle the sheer amount of emails that tried to leave our organization. And it wasn't just one sales guy, it was a bunch of others that opened it too, because why would the one person be the only one? Let's have 20 of them open it. And so they opened the files, and then it propagated itself. And how did it propagate itself? Because back then, there was no firewall on the servers, was there? It was old school. It was just a server with nothing, so it would try to make SMB attacks. It would copy itself and clone itself all over the place. Now, today, with the Windows Server firewall enabled, and with that in place, or a few years ago when we used to do IPsec policies, you could apply an IPsec policy that says only traffic from this server can talk to this server, and I'm going to reject everything else. So what we end up with is it blocks unknown and disallowed traffic. So if I'm trying to do a port scan against the SQL Server, it'll block that traffic because my machine is not allowed to talk to those servers. Now, it's a bit more of a pain to set up because you're not just building servers and hey presto, off you go. You have to really think about it. You have to go through the process of defining this server can talk to this server, and this server can talk to this server, and this server can talk to this server. So what we end up having to do is we actually end up having to do something like this, where we then start to allow known traffic to go between the infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying you have to have specific firewall infrastructure. I have clients that do that, where they have Windows Server firewall, and then Windows Server firewall, and then where the green arrows are, there's another firewall in between. You could do that. There's different infrastructure models that you can go with. It depends how secure you want to be and realistically how much money you've got. If you have a fantastic budget, you can put 50,000 firewalls around it. Does that really solve anything? Well, you'd like to think, because it's a firewall. But let's think the logic through. Let's say in between the database server and the application server, we've got the Windows Server firewalls on, and in the green line, I put a firewall right there. I'm protected now. Because everybody thinks when there's a firewall, it's protected. But how many ports do I have to open to allow the communication between those two servers? It's not one. Actually, if you look at the list, it's about 30. And it's a full range of random ports. Everybody knows. So who knows? Let's see how smart everybody is. Let's see how long you've worked with SharePoint. Who knows what port level all the service applications and things sit on? Don't let me down. Do we know what numbers they are? Sorry? Okay, that was a good one. And then there's another range that sits at the 32,500 level. These are known, they're documented. So if I'm going to be a would-be attacker, now bear in mind the attacker may not be outside. The attacker could be me. I've had a bad day. I'm a bit annoyed. I'm a disgruntled employee, because obviously there's none of those. I'm just the only one. And I get annoyed, and I go online and read something about looking at ports. I go to helloitsliam.com that outlines a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm like, I could do that. And then I start scanning everything. And between those, it works fine, because the firewall is letting those because it's valid traffic. But if I've already put server isolation in place and said only allow those ports to be accessed within this specific range of servers or this, because as an end user, I never make a call to that. As an end user, you will never make a call to a port that's at 32,500, because that's an internal communication mechanism for SharePoint. If you look at the diagrams that are online, there's a whole bunch of them that talk about the ports and protocols. Realistically, the only ports and protocols that you as an end user ever need to know about is 80 and 443. And then if you're using SharePoint Designer, there's a few other things, but that's really it. You never need your end users to connect to anything else. So let's protect them at the end, and then let's isolate the servers so they communicate to just each other. Now, what about on the edge? What do we put there? Well, the first thing for me is stop just publishing the Windows login. This is one I've talked about for about 18 months now. Who has this now? Who has an extranet that when I get to it, it just prompts me with a Windows login? I'm hoping no one. Oh, there's a couple. Can you get to your intranet this way? Can I go and type your intranet address in the browser and it just prompts that from outside? I know a few that do that. But we shouldn't be just publishing the Windows logon, because where does that prompt come from? That comes all the way from the SharePoint server. Because SharePoint, remember, doesn't do authentication. SharePoint's never done authentication. SharePoint has no concept of authenticating. So when you access the site in the morning under HTTP SharePoint, and we know that it bounces back and says, hey, can I get into the SharePoint site? What you've actually done is gone all the way down to SharePoint. SharePoint says, I don't know, let me pass you on to someone that does, and it goes to IIS. And then IIS says, oh, hey, you're configured for NTLM, let me prompt. So you're already down at the SharePoint server before the authentication happens, when the authentication prompt is presented. Realistically, you want to move that. You want to delegate that authentication to something else. So the idea here is to stop the traffic hitting the SharePoint servers. Now, the first request will always go. So I type SharePoint, it goes all the way down to the server, and the server says, I got nothing, and then it will send you back to there. Or if you're using, like the Microsoft products that we had before, which were TMG or User Access Gateway, you could pre-auth at that point. If you're using 2012 R2, Server 2012 R2, and you're using the Web Application Firewall, you can pre-auth the request. So before they even hit the SharePoint site, it's bouncing them to auth, and then the request comes in. It's a change of logic, trying to protect the users and stop them as far away as possible before they actually hit. Utilize the firewall technology, but more importantly, use multi-factor authentication. Now, bear in mind, we can use certificate services, so you can do it the hard way and install client certificates everywhere, which is a pain to manage. Or you can use Azure multi-factor services, which we've done demos before, which allows you to use a phone based on the phone factor service that Microsoft purchased, the MFA services. Or you can use a third-party approach. But protecting it on the edge is really important. So, what about the database? This is the most important place. Because if I compromise the database server, I don't care about your web front ends. The web front ends have nothing on it that I need. Everything I need is in the database. So how do we protect the database? Who does this? Okay, a few people. What are the standard ports? 1433, and there's a UDP port, 1434. 2 ports. It's funny how we all knew that. So do all the other people that are trying to find you. They all know that's there. So does all the people that write malware. They all also know that. And there's loads of tools you can download that will just broadcast across the network and try and find SQL servers. Block the standard SQL Server ports. Bit more, you have to kind of stop and set back and say, what am I going to do? I'm going to block the ports and use a different mechanism. I'm going to use a SQL alias. I'm going to use something else. Make sure you listen on non-standard ports. Implement the firewall policies correctly. So when you build your SharePoint environment, only open the ports that are needed for the services that you want to access on the SQL Server. Utilize group policies. Control that. Now, I could go one step further that I didn't put on here, would be that you could go with, similar to what they do for Office 365 infrastructure, which is they do whitelist and blacklist. So you whitelist the specific services, which would be the SQL XE, and then you blacklist everything else to control how stuff propagates between the networks and between the servers. That's a lot more complicated, but you can do that. So what's the ultimate design? You have your disk, your physical infrastructure, you have your SQL, and then you have your SharePoint implementation. So if I was going to build something super secure, I would want to make sure that if the SQL Server infrastructure was compromised, that it would be isolated to various locations. So what am I going to do? Let's see if this works again. Well, first thing, I'm going to bitlock the drives. Anybody bitlock their SQL Server drives? Good. If you're not doing it, I would do it. The overhead isn't that much, but you do need to read the documentation about how to implement SQL on bitlock drives. It's a bit more complicated than just, I'll switch it on. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to create a specific instance on my SQL infrastructure for content. And I'm going to call it content. It's only going to have content databases on it, nothing else. And now the pointer stopped working. Oh, and then I'm going to have my web applications in SharePoint that are going to be isolated to that path. So think that through for a second. I decide to, I compromise an instance, but it's the content one. I've got your content, but I don't have anything else. I don't have the configuration, I don't have the service applications, I don't have anything. So what I then do is provide more bitlock drives, and then I create a configuration instance. The configuration instance has the config database and anything else that you want to add into that configuration infrastructure. And then what we map that to is we map that to the service applications. So the service applications are isolated now to an instance on their own. So think of the logic. We're now segmenting everything out. And then finally, the last one is we're going to go ahead and have bitlock drives again. Then we're going to do what's called services instance. And services is what I class as the auxiliary services. And those, service bus, workflow management, SQL reporting services, anything that's really just auxiliary or extra to the core SharePoint implementation. So what we've now done is split what we would normally put into one SQL server into multiple instances that are controlled. So we are now protecting the boundary. Now let's go a little bit further. We're going to run those instances on different ports. We're not going to use the standard ports. We're going to say, this is the port for this one, this is the port for this one, this is the port for this one, and then we're going to tell SharePoint to use aliases for each of those instances. Now, what does that achieve? What, apart from more work for you guys? Hardware isolation, software isolation. It also does a level of obscurity. I hate to say, security by obscurity, but that does work. That does help a little bit. If I struggle to find something because it's been obscured, then that's okay. Now, this is not an easy thing to do because you have to really stop and think, and you have to have hardware that can support this. And it's not like I can just put a server up that's got 8 gig of RAM in it and expect to run 3 instances of SQL on it. Anybody who has servers that are that small, you need to build new ones. Because we should be having servers that are better spec'd. I mean, whose SharePoint environment is just one SharePoint server? 2 SharePoint servers? 3 SharePoint servers? Okay, we're getting better. 4? 5? 6? 8? Because no one should have 7, that's a weird number. 10? Wow. Over 12? Nice. 26? 54? We just keep going. Yes, I have 54 SharePoint servers. They're under my desk. I'll tell you what, when I first started working with SharePoint, and it was 2001 version that the company I work for, they asked me to install it so we could just see if it was going to be useful. So I had a desktop under my machine, under my desk, and I installed it on there as a test. And then one night, I was on call, and I got a phone call from somebody random in the organization who said, I can't get to SharePoint. I'm like, what? You can't get to SharePoint? We don't even have SharePoint. Yeah, we do. We're using it for like sales proposals and everything else. I'm like, where's the SharePoint? I realized it was the one under the desk that I'd turned off before I went home because nobody was using it. But apparently it was mission critical. I did not know that. And you know how that goes. You put it in, and you're like, yeah, put it in there, it'd be great. And they're like, why doesn't it work? I don't know. So what about web applications then? Firewall rules. I'm going to keep banging on about this one. Create the firewall rules, create the firewall rules, create the firewall rules. On the physical boxes, server isolation. You need to do server isolation. Utilize group policies, utilize claim attributes. And I know I joke about SSL certificates, but secure using SSL certificates at the front. You know what? Even if it's internal, most people I'm working with right now, they run SSL on the intranet. All the way through, inside and outside. That fixes an issue, and they have the same URL inside and outside, so we don't have those issues with alerts being different on the inside, going out to the outside and things like that. Use SSL, and don't be a cheapskate and buy one of those GoDaddy ones for $12. Because trust me, it ain't going to work so well. You need to go and buy a proper SSL certificate. You should be looking at 4096 as a minimum. And get one that actually tags it properly in the browser. And don't try and do a self-signed one and go, yeah, just put one of those in, it'll be fine. Because trust me, SSL certificate, the TLS protocol, is really close to being completely broken. So you might want to get a really good one, not just buy a cheap one. Because I know how this goes. We need an SSL certificate. I got one, it was $12.99 on GoDaddy. You might not want to use that. So, secure that. So, in general, on premises, how are we going to do it? Back to the firewall layers. Isolate the servers. Implement firewalls in between the layers if needed. But be aware that the only purpose of the firewall there is to make you feel better. That's all it is. If you put firewalls in between the server layers, it's just to make you sleep better at night. That's it, because it serves no other purpose whatsoever. Unless you're really going to sit there with Wireshark, which I've done before, and you sit between two servers and you watch Wireshark. It's amazing. If you're really struggling to sleep, try that. Put Wireshark. It's like watching a SQL profiler, isn't it? Is there anything worse? I'll do a profile of SharePoint. Yeah. In 30 seconds, it's like a terabyte of data going backwards and forwards. Run the best practice security analyzer. Anybody use this yet? Best practice analyzer, it's a great thing to use. Go ahead and run it against the server. This will tell you the services that are running, the things that should be blocked, and then control that access. Then also use the server hardening guidance that's there. Yes, Microsoft has guidance on hardening the servers. If you really get bored or you work for a government organization, then read the STIGs. They're always good fun to go through. And what's great about the STIGs is if you did them all properly, SharePoint wouldn't work anyway. But you can apply those policies on those things. So finally, what are the lessons learned for on-premises? Security is really, really hard. And when I mean it's really, really hard, I mean just proper security. Getting it right, getting the balance. I think the session that I sat in yesterday, one of the last ones for OneDrive with Sarat, was, he said it perfectly. The balance between a good user experience versus everything being secure. You can create the most ultra-secure environment ever, and your end users will never touch it because they don't want to have to go through 50 logins, so they'll copy all the data out once, and then they'll never use it again. So there has to be a balance between those two things. And what we've found now is that security is never just isolated to on-premises anymore. We don't live in that world anymore. We're now going to live in hybrid worlds. And you will do. If you're not doing it now, come 2016 and whatever else comes afterwards, you will now be living in a hybrid world. And you'll need to support both of those. You'll need to worry about external user account management, something that you may not have ever had to do before, because you will have been doing what other people have done, just creating AD accounts over here and then just giving them access. We'll now need to worry about that. Federation can be very complex. It's not a straightforward task to say, I know what we're going to do. Let's put ADFS in. Oh, okay, that's great. Have you really thought the process through? What does that actually mean? Well, that means when I put ADFS in, my end users don't get the seamless login that they kind of had before, and now they have to live in the world of a bunch of redirects in the browser that gets them confused and sometimes randomly stops working. I'm in the browser, redirect. It's a white page. What happened to SharePoint? Oh, it's not SharePoint, ADFS is having a bad day. And then you want to do it outside, and then it becomes really complex because you've got to federate outside. Then you've got to worry about multiple domains. Oh, I have one domain, now I have two domains. I mean, if you look around, if you look at the organizations right now, constantly being bought up. People are buying other groups, adding them in, and that piece of work to migrate them into. So I'll give you an example. We used to be Suskutech before we got bought by Protivity. It's now taken 2 years for us to really migrate everything over to be what we should be doing. And that's quite normal. It takes a long time to get everything back onto the same system. So what about for on-premises, for online even? Limits of external user control, which will be going away with the announcements that were made yesterday. Licensing. I don't want all my external users to have licenses. You know, I don't want to have to buy stuff for them. They're just external. I don't care about them. Directory Sync or AD Connect. If you're using DirSync, it's great. But AD Connect that's in preview right now is even better. But you're still having to do what we did. Let's have a think. What I did back in 2000, before ADFS even really existed, where we had to have shadow accounts. That's really what you're doing. You're creating a shadow account of the account that you've got on premises into the cloud so it can just go, yep, they match. But you're duplicating things. But you need to understand that there's different accounts in different locations. And of course, even in the cloud, federation can be complex. Because what are you federating to? But as everything moves, as we go to full Azure AD properly and do full federation, then it will make life a little bit easier. And then finally for me, I've talked about this before. What, why, who, how, when, where? These are the questions that you're supposed to ask. When you put SharePoint in place, do you know the answers to this? Think of that. Who are the users that are coming in? Why are they coming in? What are they trying to get to? How are they going to get in? When are they coming in and where are they coming from? And if you really sat down and asked yourselves those questions, do you even know the answers? Well, where are they coming from? I have no idea. Were they coming from a cell phone? Are they coming from an iPad? Are they coming from a Surface? Are they coming from an internet cafe that has no security whatsoever? Are they sitting on a plane using the Wi-Fi network? Are they at a conference using the Wi-Fi network that you should not really use because everything gets... No. I mean, you have no idea, do you? Do you really know? Are you using your personal machine on the Wi-Fi right now? I can find it if you want. No. What I sometimes do is I normally bring equipment with me, and in a session I'll scan all of you to find out who's here and see who's connecting. Because I can buy a device. I have a whole bunch of them. I have a device that I could put right here, right now, and all of you who thinks are connecting to the MS Ignite network would connect to my machine instead. Yes, you would. Yes, it'll probably work as well. But I could do that. Anybody can do that. You can create devices that do that. Because when your machine boots up in the morning, the first thing it does is goes, I'm looking for the Wi-Fi. Because what do? We always say auto-connect, don't we? Because nobody wants to get prompted every single time. So we auto-connect, which means your laptop then broadcasts out and says, are you there? And my device will go, I am here. And then we'll connect you. You'll be like, oh, we are in love. And then as far as you're concerned, you're surfing the internet. But you're not. You're actually going through my little device that lets me see all the traffic that you're doing. We find those all over the place. If anybody who got a Raspberry Pi while they were here, you can do that with that too. And you get a little battery pack and a wireless dongle, and you stick it under a desk, and it does the same thing. So, answer those questions. Where, what, who, why, when. And as you answer those and come up with the idea of where the authentication flows, where the users come from, you'll be able to build a better environment. So, to wrap everything up, join the conversation on the 365 network, and make sure you fill out the evals. And I'm perfectly on time. Thank you for coming for the session.